All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about imperialism, and this is something that we've kind of introduced already so far in class over the past couple of days. We've done a crash course on what it actually means to imperialize another country, and have talked about what spheres of influences are, and we've kind of just jumped into the content. Today, what I want to talk about is primarily the motives for imperialization and why these European countries went out and sought to take other lands by force and extract resources from these lands to keep that industrial machine going. In addition to that, we're also going to be talking about some effects, both positive and negative, from this time period. I will remind you that for this unit, you guys have a new essential question. That is, what role did imperialism play in shaping the modern world? So, talking about the age of imperialism, what we have defined imperialism as is a policy in which a strong nation seeks to dominate other countries politically, economically, and socially. And what we saw with that crash course video by John Green on imperialism is that there was not just one country in Europe that was necessarily doing this. It wasn't necessarily even just European countries that was going out and imperializing. It was many countries throughout Europe, Japan, and the United States as well. Today, we're just going to be talking about more of the broad themes of imperialism. But before we get going, there's a couple words I want you guys to be more familiar with. In terms of imperialism, here's another definition we could talk about, maybe simplifying it a little bit, is imperialism can also be defined as the conquering of foreign territories by powerful countries for natural resources and markets. So before we jump into the content, I want you guys to look at Africa. That's going to be the focus for imperialism in this unit. I want you to ask yourself these questions. One, using the following images, I want you to think about, why would European countries want to control Africa at all? Two, how big do you think Africa is compared to the United States? And three, what you're going to see here in a second is, after seeing the second map, how many countries or continents actually fit into Africa? So go ahead and take a second, maybe play the guessing game here, pause the video for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, jot down some ideas on your piece of note paper, and we'll continue here in a second. So we're trying to think about how big Africa is compared to the United States. We see that right here, the United States actually fits within the northwestern kind of region of the continent, in addition to many of the countries in Europe, as well as India and China. So what we're actually seeing here is that, contrary to popular belief in most maps, Africa is actually larger than many people think, and it is actually underrepresented in terms of size on most maps in terms of scale. But what you guys should understand is that this is a fairly large area, and having that understanding can help us move forward in terms of how much land was actually conquered by European countries and how much land was actually stripped away from the natives during this time period. And it gives us a little bit different of a perspective in understanding how we stack up to other continents in the world, in North America, to Africa, and Europe, and Asia. So there's a few different forms of imperialism. One, there's a colony where it's ruled directly by a foreign power. Two, a protectorate where it's controlled by a foreign power. And three, a sphere of influence, as we've already defined, as foreign power getting exclusive rights to have control in an area, but it is typically still run and operated by the native country and the native people themselves. So the main difference here is that a colony is ruled directly by a foreign power. A protectorate is just kind of like controlled and mildly told what to do. So let's talk about some motives for imperialism, and there's a good acronym that I like to use that is called RIPE, R-I-P-E. The R stands for religion. During this time period, people wanted to, especially in Europe, wanted to spread Christianity to largely educate what they believed were savage people that were not of the Christian faith and did not believe in Christian values, and felt that it was their duty to spread Christianity and to civilize, quote unquote, the uncivilized people from their perspective. It was also an ideological motivation for imperialism. There's a lot of racism throughout this time period, and basically racism can be defined as the belief that the white race or any other race is more superior, but primarily the Europeans did see themselves during this time period as more superior, and this kind of increased this racist ideological thought during the imperialistic era that also bred this idea of social Darwinism, that is the survival of the fittest, whereas only the strong survive. And it created this culture that is embodied by Rudyard Kipling in his text, The White Man's Burden, in the sense that he believed that it was the Europeans and Americans' duty to do the following: to spread Christianity, to civilize and educate other nations, and to end the slave trade. And they believed that it was their duty to take on this, to save many of the countries and people in Africa from their uncivilized ways, and Europe, and bring them into this kind of Eurocentric mindset and lifestyle. But what they did not take in the fact was that these people were fairly diverse, very diverse, and very, very well grounded in their own political structures and economic systems, and were doing just fine by themselves. But compared to what they believed, they being the European countries believed to be success and progress, they looked at it in terms of industrialization. And if anybody was not industrializing, it was not the right way to use their land or to live as a society. So the P stands for political, where there's this desire for countries to increase their empire and to flex their military muscle to show some strength, and also to boost nationalism, that is this increasing feeling of pride in one's country. Many people believe that having more colonies and more land throughout the world would ultimately lead to more kind of pride in the country, and saying, hey, we have more colonies than Great Britain does, or we have more colonies than Spain does, therefore we're better. So they're kind of basically flexing on each other in terms of their colonial power and colonial acquisitions. And lastly, we have economic reasons. Basically, the Industrial Revolution, they needed more natural resources and raw materials to basically keep this Industrial Revolution going within Europe. They also needed cheap labor and to expand trading markets so that all the things that they were producing would eventually be sold to other people, and keep this kind of vicious cycle of the industrial machine making money and continuing to progress. So the idea of also having colonies would allow these countries to control foreign trade. That means if you own the means of trade and the means of production, you can start to make things really cheap and sell them to a lot more people for a bigger profit. So Africa before imperialism, we should understand that there was over 1,000 different languages and groups, and you guys kind of saw this from your map assignment. And really, there was no European presence in this continent of the region, except for kind of towards a northeastern section where we know today to be Egypt, for roughly 400 years. And mostly only missionaries were exploring the interior portions of the continent. And here it kind of brings us to the Belgian Congo. And the Belgian Congo is important because of this guy named King Leopold. He hired explorer named David Stanley to explore and claim the Congo for Belgium. And this is kind of highlights this idea that this explorer was David Stanley was able to make treaties with the local chiefs along the Congo River, but ultimately led and opened the gates for other European countries to come in and exploit the Africans and their land to extract those raw materials, because he was able to successfully go into the Africa which had previously been fairly difficult territory and terrain to navigate, and basically created a map so that people from Europe and explorers could go in and basically imperialize the inner portions of the continent. which ultimately led to the scramble for Africa, where we have Europeans fearing war over territorial claims in Africa. And you can kind of see that from this cartoon, political cartoon on the left-hand side, is that you have roughly 14 European nations meeting in 1884 for what was called the Berlin Conference to divide up Africa and make it so that every European country has control over a piece of it, and that nobody's being left out so that they don't go to war. So what we actually see at this conference is that Africa's got borders drawn for them, and it is divided without any regard for the people that are actually living there, that have been living there for hundreds of years prior to European contact. So after the Berlin Conference, we start to see the continent of Africa look like this, kind of as you guys saw from your map assignment. It established basically the following: that European occupation of African territory had to be recognized by other countries, and that no single European power could claim Africa itself. And ultimately, this led to a further increase in tension between many European countries trying to get as much colonies as possible. So let's talk about some of the benefits in terms of what did imperialism bring to the table for society during this time period. On one hand, it had some economic benefits of kind of bringing in industrial goods and spreading them around the world. It also created new jobs as industry started to be built up in other countries because of the increase in raw materials. And we start to see that there's infrastructure improved throughout both European countries and also some within the interior portions of Africa, such as roads, railroads, and other postal services. There's also some social benefits. We start to see schools and universities opened where there was not before. We also start to see that there's better medicine produced and hospitals introduced to some of these regions of the world that was being imperialized. But ultimately, what imperialism is going to lead to is this kind of vast empire that Britain had kind of constructed over the past century, a few centuries, to the point where you see on this map on the right-hand side of the screen is that everywhere there is red, that is a area controlled by Great Britain, some sort of colony. So there's this term that is kind of often attributed with them, that the sun never actually set on the British Empire, meaning that the sun somewhere shone at some point throughout the day on a colony controlled by Great Britain. That's just basically how big they were. And we also see that nationalism is growing in these conquered regions, and these rivalries are developing tension between European countries that will eventually lead to what we will start second semester off with, that is World War I and the outbreak of a global war because of this tension created and stemming from the imperialistic era. But the takeaway point that you guys should come away from this unit is that imperialism drastically uprooted the lives of many of the natives within African countries, and also places throughout Asia and other places around the world as well, and really disrupted their lives, disrupted their societies, their economies, their political structures, and ultimately has led to hundreds of years of about 100 to 120 years of social and economic and political problems within these areas because they had been oppressed for so long. So what we should really be taking away is that with imperialism, we see a drastic change for the native people, and oftentimes this change resulted in exploitation and sometimes even death for many of these native populations because of European lust for power, resources, and increased land claims.